So as I'm sure most of you probably know, every Wednesday on the channel I feature and react to your Bulls hot takes, and after the hot takes video I uploaded yesterday, of course I received even more takes, which I'll use for next week's video, but there was one take, and it was more of a question really. And I was so glad that this person asked this because a few months back I had an idea to do this video, and generally when an idea pops into my head I write it down. Well, in this one I didn't do it for some reason. I can't remember why, probably because I was out with my daughter. And anyway, I got sidetracked and completely forgot about it, and then we were in the middle of the season and other topics came up. So I really appreciate this question from D. Roberts. If The Last Dance never happened and the front office at the time wanted to keep MJ and co for another season, would they have won a fourth consecutive title? And since it's now the off season, what better time than to revisit this hypothetical scenario? And that's what I want to talk about in today's video. So what's going on, everyone? You are listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. So whether you've been a longtime Bulls fan or a new one, or you were a fan back in the 90s and stopped following them after MJ retired, or you're just a casual fan who likes the game of basketball, which by the way, I don't mean that as an insult. There's nothing wrong with being a casual fan. I myself am a casual baseball fan. But whatever your fandom might be, I can say with almost certainty that you know about the Chicago Bulls dynasty of the 1990s, whether you were alive at the time or you weren't. And you know this because arguably the most iconic sports figure of all time, and Michael Jordan, was the man who led the Bulls in the 90s. Now, if you're maybe not as familiar with the Bulls run in the 1990s, well, essentially the Bulls won 6 titles in the form of 2 three-peats, meaning they won 3 straight titles, first in 91, 92, and 93, and then again in 96, 97, and 98. The 2-year gap in titles is when MJ decided to retire from the game and go play baseball after his father's death, which was always a dream of his father for his son to play. And to be honest, even as I'm saying this now, I may just have to make a video on whether the Bulls would have gone on to win 8 straight titles had Michael Jordan never retired, and we'll have to save that for a different day. Let me know what you guys think in the comments though on that one. But anyway, in that final season of the Bulls winning the title in 1998, it was a foregone conclusion that this would be the last year of the Bulls dynasty because the egomaniac Jerry Krause, the team's GM, didn't get along with Phil Jackson and made it abundantly clear that the 97-98 season would be his last coaching the Chicago Bulls. Well, of course, Michael Jordan said he wouldn't play for any other coach other than Phil Jackson and would retire as a result. Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman would also leave, as well as some of the other key rotational players, and the dynasty was effectively over, the Bulls essentially in a full-blown rebuild with Tony Kukoc now being their best player. Now, the reason this question is interesting is because in the documentary The Last Dance that came out last year, which was a great documentary, by the way. I'm sure most of you have seen it, but if you haven't, definitely do yourself a favor and go check it out. But in that documentary, towards the end of it, Michael Jordan implies that if the front office and ownership had all given the main guys, meaning him, Pippen, Rodman, 1-year extensions to see if they could come back and win a 7th title, that they would have done it. Oh, and this also would mean that they would extend Phil Jackson 1 more season. And what's even funnier is Jerry Reinsdorf in the documentary said he actually spoke to Phil Jackson after winning that last title and mentioned that despite what Krause had said about you not returning, if you want to come back for 1 more year, that you could. He even went on to say that he has earned that right, which, yeah, you're damn well right, he did. He won you 6th ring in 8-year span of 8 years. But I think Phil Jackson really just had enough of the politics and the shenanigans of the front office and ownership, which you can't really blame him for, and he decided to take the high road and leave the team before going on to win another 5 championships with the LA Lakers. Now, obviously, as Bulls fans, and in hindsight, this was a huge mistake, because even if the Bulls players were getting up there in age and there was a time that, you know, they would start to decline shortly, you don't get rid of a coach like Phil Jackson. But be that as it may, Phil Jackson left and everything else came crumbling down, and the Bulls were a dumpster fire of a franchise for a better part of the decade after that. But what if we could rewrite history and Jerry Krause could put his small man ego complex aside, and the ownership not being petty as well with the way in which they treated Scottie Pippen, and they were able to leave the 98 title team intact for the following season? Could they have won their 4th straight title and their 7th overall? Well, let's take a quick peek at the 97-98 roster. And again, we're going to assume the roster stays intact, which I'm sure, you know, some of the rotational players, there might have been some slight variations. Even if the Bulls were able to extend Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman and Ron Harper all for 1 year. But we'll leave that aside for now, because the important piece here is that big three. I mean, you look at this lineup and it brings back memories, man. Jason Caffey, I really like that guy. I thought he was a very underrated player. Steve Kerr, still love Steve Kerr. Judd Bushler, another great outside shooter off the bench. But anyway, what makes the question a little more challenging is that the following season, the NBA went into a lockout, right? And the season ended starting late, and the season itself was reduced from an 82-game schedule down to 50 games in total. Now, initially you might think, well, that might have gone against the Bulls because they were still riding off the momentum from last season, and a short season can impact a team's playoff chances or seeding if one team starts off slow and they find themselves too far behind in catching up, in their seeding, whereas in normally scheduled season, they would probably have plenty of games to catch up for it. So in a 50-game season, every game is pretty critical because the margin of error is so thin when it comes to your overall standing. There isn't going to be as much separation as there would be in a 82-game schedule. However, I actually think the lockout would have worked in the Bulls' favor, because you also have to remember the big three were all getting up there in age by 1998. Michael Jordan would have been 35 going into the 99 season, Rodman 37, Scottie Pippen 33, Ron Harper would have been 35, Steve Kerr would have been 33, hell, even Luke Longley was going to be 30. Not that, they were all going to be old players by any means, but they were getting a little up there in age. And you're talking about three guys that just won 3 titles, playing long seasons and long postseasons, and having shorter off seasons than most of the teams around the league, who end up, going from the end of the finals to the start of the regular season. That's a lot of mileage for guys in their mid to late 30s. But with the lockout, the regular season was put on hold until January of the next year. So it would have given the players more rest, more time to recuperate from a long season and a draining 3 straight championships. I mean, if you saw the documentary, that Michael Jordan and the guys were not only just physically drained from the multiple title runs, but also emotionally drained. So to give them that kind of break, where you're talking about over 6 months, would be a huge advantage for a veteran team like the Bulls. So because of the lockout season, the Bulls played, the players would have gotten an extended break. It allows their bodies to take more time off and come out to start the season refreshed. Now, if you look at some of the top teams in the league from that season, of course, the Spurs ended up winning the title that year. Their franchise's first title, which was led by David Robinson and a young Tim Duncan. But in the East, this is where things get a little wonky, because the Knicks went to the NBA Finals that season and they were the 8th seed. So it shows you the impact that a 50-game season has on playoff seeding, because they likely should have never been that low in the playoff standings. And the number 1 seed Miami Heat, who they actually beat in the first round, had no business being the number 1 seed and probably wouldn't have been if it were a full 82 games. The other team that was a top contender in the East was the Indiana Pacers. You still have the likes of Reggie Miller and Mark Jackson, who were high offensive scorers. They were the 2 seed but lost to the Knicks in the Eastern Conference Finals. The Magic were the 3 seed, but they lost in the first round. The Hawks were the 4 seed, didn't make it past the second. So really, you're talking about the Knicks and the Pacers being the most formidable foes for the Bulls in the Eastern Conference. And really, the only team that would have somewhat scared me is the Pacers, because the Bulls narrowly beat the Pacers in 7 games in the Eastern Conference Finals the season before, the one in which they won their last championship. The Pacers almost ended the Bulls' last dance, although I think you have to admit, with Michael Jordan, it never was really in doubt, and you know that he's going to win a game when it's in Game 7. The Knicks, no, I wouldn't have been as worried about them at all. A good team, but Ewing was getting older as well as starting to decline. That they had some strong enforcers like Anthony Mason, but the Bulls always knew how to handle this team. And even though the Pacers would have been a challenge, given they were pretty young, they were much younger than the Bulls were, I still think the aging Bulls, when you still have Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, they would have been no match for someone like Reggie Miller and the Pacers. So that leaves us really with the Spurs, right? Since the Spurs made it out of the West, and they were a strong team. They were the number 1 seed, finishing with the best record in the league, again, in 50 games anyway. They had a superstar and future Hall of Famer in David Robinson, and they hit the lottery jackpot by getting a generational talent in Tim Duncan with the number 1 pick in the draft a couple years prior. And of course, they were being coached by a very young then Greg Popovich. This is where, I think things will get a little challenging for the Bulls, because not only would the Bulls be going against their first real superstar big man in the finals in David Robinson, because really in all the finals appearances that the Bulls went through throughout the 90s, they were never going against a superstar center. And back in those days of the NBA, that was a big deal, not as much in today's NBA. And I like Luke Longley, but he was no match for someone like David Robinson. On top of that, you already have arguably the greatest front court duo of all time, the Twin Towers, Tim Duncan, to add to David Robinson, Tim Duncan playing the power forward. And this would have been a young Tim Duncan, 22-year-old who was already an all-star. And even though I'd like to think that Dennis Rodman, who was an incredible defender and rebounder, would handle Tim Duncan, I just don't know if that would have been the case for a 37-year-old Rodman. In addition to that, the Spurs had a great point guard in Avery Johnson, and a solid shooting guard in Sean Elliott, and key players coming off the bench like Mario Elie, Jaren Jackson, who was the father of Jaren Jackson Jr., by the way, and Jerome Kersey. This was a stacked team. I would argue the best team the Bulls would have ever faced in any of their finals matchups, and really because the Bulls never had to go against any strong big man. I mean, you're talking about Greg Ostertag versus David Robinson, and obviously they never ran into Hakeem Olajuwon because Michael Jordan retired those years in 94 and 95. And even power forwards, like, yes, the Bulls went against one of the greatest power forwards to play the game in Karl Malone, but Malone wasn't as tall and lengthy as Tim Duncan that Rodman would have, been able to fight for rebounds. The Bulls faced off against Charles Barkley in 93, who was also an all-time great power forward, but again, a smaller power forward, someone Horace Grant easily towered over. So this is a hard one, really. Like, I'm trying to view this as objectively as possible without being biased. You have to think this is likely a final series the Bulls lose, because it would be the first real test for them in having a star-studded front court. And not just stars, these were superstars and future Hall of Famers. This is not something like the Bulls have ever faced in all their finals appearances. And the Bulls are much older at this point. But all of that being said, the Bulls had Michael Jordan, the ultimate competitor, the guy who never lost in the finals. And even though he would have been 35, we all know MJ would come back and played for the Wizards. He did at 39 and was still a very productive player, not the same player he used to be, but still very good. And coming off a title run and knowing MJ's killer instinct, and of course, I'm sure he would have found a way to take something personally in that series that would have motivated him to win. And because this is still the dynasty of the Bulls we're talking about here, the greatest team ever, I've got to go with the Bulls and winning the championship. And yes, I know I'm a little biased in that regard, but I just think you can't bet against someone like Michael Jordan in the finals. He's not going to lose that battle. So in summary, yes, I do think the Bulls would have won their 4th straight title, their 7th championship in franchise history, if only the front office and the ownership had sucked up their pride and kept the team together to see if they could put one more title run in the books. But of course, that didn't happen, and the Bulls have yet to win a championship ever since, and in fact, have never even gone back to the finals since then. But anyway, let me know what you guys think, though. Do you think the Bulls would have won the title in 1999 in the lockout season had they kept the dynasty team together for one more year? Let me know in the comments, and I'll also create a community poll for this as well. As always, guys, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.